Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 306. If you're listening to this, it means I did not in fact get randomly axed by a Viking in Scandinavia and have in fact made it back home. This week the questions are taken from Guide 383, that's the guide to HMS Caledonia and the Caledonia class ships of the line, and the Wednesday video on HMAS Castlemaine. Silver John asks, looking at some of the drawings of the ships, I've noticed that the lower gun deck ports were pretty close to the waterline. This is on the Caledonias. It made me wonder how watertight the ports were when they closed, as it looked like waves or even heeling over in a strong wind might leave them vulnerable to flooding. Well, that's a good question, and somewhat ironic for the Caledonia class, as the Caledonia class were noted as actually having their lower gun ports somewhat higher above the waterline than was typical for a first-rate ship of the line, a three-decker. So, yeah, although they're pretty close to the waterline there, on a lot of others they're even closer, which, yes, that can be a little bit worrying. But specifically to your question, they were actually surprisingly watertight, and that comes down to two primary factors, although there are a number of other secondary factors involved as well. The primary factors are that, whilst, as you can see here on Hibernia, they are relatively thin, they are not just lids that sit atop the hull or square ports that sit in the hull. They are in fact chamfered. So that, I mean, most of you know what chamfering is, but essentially the outside face is larger than the inside face, and there's an angle to the edges, and that matches up with chamfering in the gun port itself. So it sits a lot more snugly in the port, and when water presses on the gun port lid, then instead of, if you had just a square one which had a clear swing, it would just potentially swing a little bit further in and thus allow water in or potentially break its hinges entirely. Because of the chamfering, it's essentially just being pressed into the hull, which actually increases the quality of the seal. Some gun port lids could also have a little bit of tarred rope or something like that placed on them to help with the seal, but of course if you don't do that completely evenly you might actually end up breaking the seal. It depends how good the chamfering matches up between the gun port and the gun port lid, so things do vary in that regard to a certain extent. But the other factor of course is that wood expands when wet, so if you have to close gun ports because everything is getting soaked or has the potential of being soaked, not only have you got this chamfered lid that's a pretty good seal in the first place, and yes, it's painted, so in theory the wood shouldn't get too wet, but it will get somewhat damp, and the more water is bashed up against it, the more that wood is going to swell slightly, which is actually going to, again, improve the seal still further. And they're not just held down by gravity. You can actually, secure them internally as well to stop gravity as the ship rolls, for example, potentially opening them again. Of course, nothing's perfect and you might get a small amount of leakage, but that's what your bilge pumps are for. The problem with gun port lids was that in a really big storm, a catastrophic level storm, as you can see again from the photo, whilst they're relatively thick, they're nowhere near as thick as the rest of the hull. So in an absolutely catastrophic storm situation, it is possible that gun port lids could be stove in by the waves, especially if the ship happens to end up broadside onto them. This is known to have happened in some extreme circumstances, but that's relatively rare. And to be perfectly honest, if you're in a storm situation where you are caught broadside on to the waves and the waves are strong enough to smash in your gun port lids, you were probably going to die anyway, and the fact your gun port lid stove in and you sank that way was just one of the many ways in which you were inevitably going to die, possibly from being driven ashore, possibly from being rolled over, having your mast snapped, or just having the hull broke open. There would be a very marginal chance of survival in those kinds of situations if you ended up broadside onto waves that big. Vicky asks, during the January 2023 live stream, as part of your answer to one of my questions, you said that trying to use a cruiser with 32 6-inch guns as an anti-destroyer machine gun would be risky, as it would need to get close enough to enemy destroyers that they could potentially torpedo it. If 32 6-inch guns can't reach out far enough to reliably swat enemy destroyers before they can launch torpedoes, wouldn't the secondary batteries of World War II-era capital ships, which had many fewer guns per broadside and also sometimes smaller in caliber, have practically no hope of being useful in the anti-surface role? Doesn't this make an effective dual-purpose gun an unworkable concept until the immediate post-war era, because the anti-surface role, in order to reliably kill enemy destroyers when they're still well out of torpedo range, requires a gun too large and heavy to be usable as a heavy anti-aircraft gun until the breakthroughs in heavy auto-loaded guns immediately post-war? So I went back and looked at the question and my response again, and potentially this is one of the slight limitations of live streaming, in that you have to pretty much answer spur of the moment, so the full context of what I'm thinking doesn't necessarily always come through. So the issue I had with the concept was not necessarily the guns themselves, because as you say, 4, 5, 6-inch secondary batteries are present all the time, and a lot of the time their effective engagement range is pretty much the same as or inside the effective engagement range of destroyers with torpedoes. So if a destroyer is present and aiming to fire torpedoes at you, then you can respond. But you have to look at the context of the uses. For a battleship secondary battery to be engaging destroyers that are trying to launch torpedoes, something has already gone very wrong, because that means that the destroyers have broken through your own destroyers, if you had some, and your own cruisers, again, if you had some, and if you went in without any destroyer cruiser escort against destroyers with battleships, you pretty much deserve what's coming to you. And therefore these are weapons of last resort, ideally with a shell big enough that you can cripple the destroyer if you happen to hit it. Thus, in theory, assuming that you've played everything correctly, if destroyers have broken through your screens and are now engaging your battleships, there shouldn't be too many of them. Ideally, some or all of them should be damaged to varying extents and or possibly still under fire from the surviving cruisers and destroyers of your screen. And so your battleship secondary guns engaging those destroyers in an attempt to finish them off or dissuade them from firing on you is better than nothing. I mean, at that point, you'd probably be engaging them with your primary guns as well, but if it's part of a big fleet battle and your main guns are engaging the enemy battleships and battlecruisers, then you might just go with your secondaries. So that's the context of battleship secondaries, whereas the suggestion you put forward with the 32 6-inch guns was on a 30,000-ton plus fast cruiser hull. Now, the problem I had with that is that, firstly, that's going to be on the front lines, and therefore, in the event of a mass destroyer attack, it's going to be facing, theoretically, a lot more destroyers, which are, at the beginning of the engagement, intact, as opposed to a battleship secondary battery, as we mentioned, which shouldn't be facing that threat. But also, because it would be a 30-plus thousand-ton cruiser hull, there aren't going to be that many of them. And that was kind of the main problem I had, in that you, instead of having, let's say, half a dozen smaller cruisers, or even 3 or 4, which split their firepower, admittedly, between them, but also split their physical location in, multiple points, by having just the one ship, at least on that side of your escort line, because let's face it, even if you have 2 or 3 in a big fleet, you're very unlikely to have more than one on any specific arc. That single vessel is going to become the target for pretty much every destroyer that it can threaten, and it can threaten a lot of them with that many 6-inch guns, which means a lot of torpedoes going to come its way, and that's where my concern that it would be relatively easily torpedoed, not strictly because of the engagement ranges of torpedoes and the guns, but simply because it's going to be exposed to a fully intact destroyer attack, which is going to send so many torpedoes at it that it's pretty much doomed, because statistically it probably won't be able to avoid that many torpedoes. And unless you absolutely cover the thing in fire control computers, which would be very ahistorical, it's probably not going to be able to engage anywhere close to the number of destroyers that would be coming at it in a full-scale fleet engagement. So some of them, indeed perhaps many of them, would be getting free shots. Whereas if you split that same firepower over 3 or 4 cruisers, that's 3 or 4 separate sets of fire control equipment, plus obviously each individual cruiser's secondaries, which means you can actually engage multiple destroyers, and means that if the destroyers do want to gang up on any one target, even if they manage to and sink one, you haven't lost all of your firepower at once. So it's more the all the eggs in one basket element that I was concerned about, rather than the fact that whether or not it could or couldn't rip apart destroyers, because it definitely could rip apart single destroyers or small numbers of destroyers. But if you're building a 32 gun, 30,000 ton plus 35 knot cruiser, in theory you're aiming at an enemy that has dozens upon dozens of destroyers, at which point it's actually, I think, too much force concentrated in one rather obvious target. Ross Wenson asks, acceptance trials, did any fail so badly that the ships were rejected for service, and what were the consequences for the designers or builders? Yes and no. There are relatively rare cases of vessels that have been constructed for a specific navy being rejected outright by said navy. So Canada's first 2 submarines, CC-1 and CC-2, are actually a product of this. They were built in the US for the Chilean navy, but then when they went out on trials, the Chileans said, these subs are coming nowhere close to the operational range that we specified, and the manufacturers essentially said, well, there's nothing we can really do about that, like it or lump it, and the Chileans said, okay, fine, well, we reject these submarines, we're not paying you for them, go away. At which point the builder in question suddenly had a pair of completed submarines on their hands that they weren't going to get paid for, so they went shopping for someone else who needed submarines and wasn't so bothered about the fact that they didn't have the range required to operate up and down the Chilean coast. And so they ended up being bought by Canada. But this kind of thing is relatively rare. There's a slightly more common corollary to that, which is especially in the 19th century, when certain vessels were built on speculation, either by inventors or by companies, because there was such a market for a certain type of vessel, whether that be a submarine, a cruiser, a destroyer, whatever, that they just build them and go, hey, random navy, do you want this thing that we built? It's really cool. And sometimes the navies would put them on trial and go, yeah, but it's not really what we're looking for, and thanks but no thanks. Very often privately built vessels suffered this fate. There's records, for example, in the US Navy of a number of privately built submarines being offered for trials for the US Navy. Now, obviously, that's unsolicited. The US Navy hasn't invested any money in them at that point, but they hold the trials and they go, well, the performance isn't really up to what we want, so no thanks, we won't be taking you up on that offer. Now, the much more common way that this kind of thing happens is not a flat-out, outright rejection, but it's kind of a soft rejection. And trials are supposed to break things, because everyone accepts that no ship fresh in the water is going to be 100%. So you run things to find out which bits are not quite 100%, and then you fix them, and then the ship enters service. But there have been cases all across various navies where a ship has been sent out to trial and something has gone so catastrophically and fundamentally wrong that the Navy has turned around and said, we do not accept this submarine, destroyer, cruiser, battleship, carrier, whatever, into service in the state that it is currently in. Now, the difference between what happened with the Chilean submarines that became CC-1 and CC-2 and this kind of rejection is that it is not an outright rejection. It's not saying, right, we're not taking possession of this vessel at all, go flog it to someone else, we don't care. And by the way, we're taking some of our money back. It's this vessel has certain flaws which we cannot accept for it to be in active service. However, here's the list of problems, go back and fix them. Because usually people have invested a fair amount of money. They've made down payments on those ships. So if they did refuse them, it would be a very complicated legal case to get a bunch of that money back. And once you're talking about things like cruisers or battleships or carriers, you're talking about major strategic assets, which A, you would then be without, and B, potentially an opponent would be with if they bought them. And combined with the fact that most of the time, shipyards don't produce something that's so catastrophically bad it isn't going to be useful in some way, shape, or form, then the shipyards have to take back their faulty product, make good the issues, and then come back and say, hey, look, here's the same ship, we've fixed the things you highlighted, put it back on trials, and then hopefully the Navy goes, okay, now it works, now we're happy to accept it. This can bring back several times in really bad cases, and exactly who's liable for payment does depend somewhat, because sometimes there'll be clauses in the contract that will say, here's the operational range of this bit of equipment or this feature of the ship. But if the Navy says, actually, well, it's operating at the lower end, but we want it to be where we said it was going to be, there may be some liabilities of modification for the Navy to pay, especially if the shipyard can argue that the reason it's not working as intended is because of other changes after the final design was signed off that the Navy made, that maybe have added weight or something like that. But if it's something like, the contract says the power plant should produce 75,000 shaft horsepower and the power plant only produces 65,000 shaft horsepower, well, assuming it's the same power plant that was signed off on, that's entirely on the shipyard. They have to fix it, which obviously can end up costing them a lot of money. More recently, in the time period the channel doesn't cover, there have actually been a few more ships, especially very recently, which have been outright rejected as not fit for service. But of course, that's out of the scope of my remit. Willendor asks, during the pre-American Revolution age of sail times, in which navy could someone of the lowest social class make the most of their naval career rank-wise? If you go back to the early part of the 1700s, probably actually the French Navy. Theoretically, in the Royal Navy, anyone who demonstrated enough skill could come up through the ranks and become an admiral. And indeed, some did. But there were loose systems of patronage and, the old boys club from the nobility, which would gradually coalesce, become more and more of a problem. Then someone would try and purge it all, and it would be good for a little bit, and then it would become more and more of a problem again. In the Spanish Navy, as far as I'm aware at the time, there was much more of a class divide. Again, you could have the occasional very lucky individual come up from the ranks, but the divide between the general crew and the relatively aristocratic officer corps was far more evident. But in the heading to the early mid part of the 1700s, and even in the middle of the 1700s to a certain extent, in the French Navy, they actually recognized officers as being able to come from both aristocratic and meritocratic backgrounds, to the extent that they were almost divided up into two separate officer cadres. Weirdly enough, although perhaps in context it makes more sense, the aristocratic officers tended to prefer assignments ashore for, commanding dockyards and bases and admin positions and so forth, mostly because they were aristocratic and therefore they wanted to manage their estate and their affairs at home, both of the business and the female variety, and being at sea for months at a time compromised that. Obviously there were exceptions, but that was the general rule. Whereas the meritocratic officers tended to be more along the lines of, I actually want to go out at sea and explore things and fight France's enemies and so on and so forth. And so you got this divide of most of the at-sea officers tended to be meritocratic, with a leavening of aristocrats who either thought that someone should be in charge of the hoi polloi or just wanted to get away from it all, and vice versa ashore. The problem then occurred towards the mid and then latter part of the 1700s of the aristocratic officers. This is a huge simplification of what was a centuries-long social dynamic process, but essentially getting jealous of the fact that the meritocratic officers at sea, being at sea, tended to actually do the things that were exciting and get all of the glory, And they gradually began pushing the meritocratic officers out, which ended up being something of their detriment because they completed this process about a decade or two before the French Revolution, at which point most of the officer corps of the French Navy at that point was aristocratic, and then the Revolution chopped off all their heads, which literally and figuratively decapitated the French Navy. But pre-American Revolution, which is most of the early part, early mid part of the 1700s, if you are a random farmer born in the middle of your country and you want to join the Navy and maybe get all the way up to Admiral, if you have the requisite skills and intelligence, then yeah, the French Navy at that time period is probably your single best bet. Firefox60 asks, in the book Convoy Escort Commander, a destroyer, a V-class, is featured and is mentioned to have had boilers removed and replaced with fuel tanks. How common was this in practice, and when did the Royal Navy start doing this? Was anything similar done in other navies? Whilst not common as in, oh yeah, there's dozens and dozens and dozens of these things that have had this done, it wasn't an unknown practice. So, for example, this is HMS Vidette, a V-class destroyer, and as you may notice if you look at images of her from her World War I and interwar configuration, she's missing a funnel amongst various other changes. And that's because she, along with almost 24 other V&W class, were taken in hand, and they had their forward boiler removed, which also meant you could take out the forward funnel, and replaced with a fuel tank, which meant they became longer range and could be used on convoy escort duty. The trade-off, of course, is if you remove some of the power plant, speed drops, so they went from being capable of over 30 knots to being capable of around 25 knots, but long distance 25 knots was perfectly fine for convoy escort. Obviously, they were never going to be full fleet destroyers again in that state, but the V&W class by World War II were old enough that you could afford to sacrifice some of them to boost your convoy escort numbers quickly, because that was seen as more necessary than having a few relatively low capability frontline destroyers, especially when mass destroyer production, wartime emergency flotillas and stuff, was ongoing. There were a few other ships that had similar modifications done, so we're talking about a few dozen ships that had it occur, so it would not be an unfamiliar sight, especially on the Atlantic convoys, but it wasn't common. It was essentially an emergency stopgap procedure. In terms of similar things being done in other navies, yes, this was done. In the Japanese Navy, for instance, a variety of very old destroyers were converted into patrol craft of various descriptions, with similar changes enacted. And the US Navy did a program which had similar effective results, albeit for different purposes, with a bunch of the old four-stacker destroyers, which would have some of their power plant removed in exchange for fuel tanks, which gave them longer range, which was very important in the Pacific. It cut their speed down, not as much as on V&Ws, but that's because the four-stackers had a much higher top speed in the first place. And in those roles, the four-stackers were used for all sorts of things like fast troop transports and the like. Again, they don't no longer have the frontline speed of frontline destroyers, but they don't need them because they're no longer being used for those frontline uses, albeit obviously in the US Navy, as I said, they're using them as APDs and such like. They're not using them as convoy escorts because, well, by the time the US Navy is involved in the war period, and especially by the time they start these conversions, they have more than enough destroyer escorts and so forth to throw at the escort problem that they don't really need to worry about sending four stackers that have been halfway converted into that particular fray. Damian Parowski asks, my question for the video on HMAS Castlemaine is, who was manning and turning the deck guns while you were filming the drone footage? That would be a couple of subscribers. Well, you can see here, there's the 4-inch gun. It's tracked in on the drone, and as the drone moves past, you might be able to spot me actually piloting the thing. There's Dr. Clark in his violently Iron Brew shirt just in front of the gun, but the gun is in fact just about tracking. Now, the reason I'm using these two shots, there's one sequence now and one you'll see in a minute, is because as we come round aft, you'll notice that a couple of people are also manning one of the aft AA guns, although I don't think they were specifically trying to track the drone. I think it was just the 4-inch gun there that was doing that job. Now, that was actually quite fun because it gave the ship a little bit more of a live action verisimilitude and well spotted. But in September, when I head over to the US for the Historical Naval Ships Association conference, I suppose I should probably let people know now, I'm gradually putting together a schedule of things that I would like to do while I'm there. If you happen to be in the upstate New York area, specifically in or around the vicinity of Albany, if the weather is conducive to drone flying and if the museum ship is happy to let me do it, I want to visit USS Slater because pretty much all of her guns are functional, and I'd like to get all of them manned to do a mass tracking shot of the drone as it goes round. Now, obviously, I have to communicate with Slater and get their permission to do that in the first place, and then we have to hope it's not bucketing it down with rain. But, spoiler alert, if you happen to live in that area, that might happen. John Fisher asks, in many videos you've mentioned how difficult it was to keep a large coal-powered ship at full speed for any great length of time. Just how hot did it get in the boiler rooms of a coal-powered ship, and what, if any, efforts were made to keep the stokers on their feet? Did they have different teams of stokers and use them in tag teams, with one team resting while another shoveled coal? How hot the boiler room got depended on quite a number of factors. Obviously, how much power was the ship producing, but assuming that things chugging along at full speed, you've then also got to factor in what is the external temperature, because a boiler room where a ship is thrashing along at full speed, in the middle of winter at the edge of the Arctic Circle is going to be a very different thing compared to a ship that's trying to do that on the equator or in the Mediterranean. You've also got to take account of, is the ship operating under forced draft? Because under forced draft you have big ventilator fans blowing air in, which in theory would cool you down, but equally that's increasing the temperature of the boilers, which is going to warm everything up. So it's kind of a win some, lose some in those particular circumstances. But you have high temperatures recorded as being in the low to mid 40s of degrees as being quite typical. Obviously, it's going to vary somewhat. If you are a stoker like this chap here right in front of the firebox, your local temperature is going to be much, much higher than someone halfway across the boiler room who's bringing coal over. So you're talking about high hundreds, low 110s of Fahrenheit. Now, that would be fairly typical for a ship operating at full power, again, assuming there's not major environmental factors outside affecting all of this. But once forced draft kicks in, or let's say you have a poorly ventilated workspace or something like that, then things can get a lot worse. Temperatures in those kinds of ships, if they went into the Mediterranean or something like that, could get as high as 60 degrees Celsius or 140 degrees Fahrenheit in the boiler rooms, and this was held to be untenable for any particular length of time. And if you want to get really bad, there have been occasional recorded temperatures as high as the low 70s of degrees Celsius, so you're talking about the mid to upper 160s degrees in Fahrenheit, although at that point, it was reported that people were fainting dead away within 10 to 15 minutes of going into the boiler rooms, which isn't exactly surprising. Now, in those upper ranges, the unacceptable, 50, 60, 70 plus degree temperatures, there's not a huge amount you can do. You just have to try and bring the temperature down, because even if you did operate in tag teams, you'd run out of men very, very quickly. In the lower temperatures, so maybe you might scrape in some ideal circumstances the very lowest of 50s, but in your 40s of degrees, then in those circumstances, actually, as long as you kept them supplied with water, the men could actually keep going for quite a surprising amount of time. The bigger problem at that stage was exhaustion, because to keep the boilers fed and up to a temperature such that the boiler room got that hot in the first place, you were shoveling coal quite a bit. So at that point, the stokers would just come down exhausted and say, look, I physically can't move this coal anymore, because they're doing it at such a high rate. Obviously, heat exhaustion would play a factor there as well. And then you would have to shift stokers in, But once again, you don't have that many stokers to shift in. If you're getting to the point where you're wearing your stokers out, you either have to accept that this is going to be a very, very short-term burst of speed, or you're going to have to bring the temperature down by lowering the ship's speed. Lon Johnson asks, did World War II battles where both sides had cruisers or battleships ever include ships smaller than a destroyer? I know a 4-inch gun won't do much, but I could imagine the captain of a corvette or a sloop not wanting to run when he could potentially do something. It did happen, although not usually by design. Usually such ships tried to stay away from big ship battles, but for example at the Battle of Barents Sea, you had 2 German heavy cruisers, and the British had a couple of light cruisers present. Both sides had destroyers, but there were also trawlers, corvettes, and a minesweeper present on the British side because, of course, the whole battle ranged around a convoy, and those smaller ships were the convoy escorts for obviously taking on submarines and aircraft. And while these kinds of battles are certainly not common, you can essentially divide things where you've got ships of both sides actually having a go at each other rather than aircraft carriers and so forth into 2 broad categories. You either have where warships have gone looking for other warships, and obviously in those cases where it's a battle of choice to a certain degree, you don't tend to have these smaller vessels because they're usually too slow and nowhere near powerful enough to be considered for the role, so they're just not going to take them with. But then you have battles where one side or the other is defending something, whether that be a convoy, a landing, or something else similar that is not a warship related. And that's where you tend to find the smaller craft. And then if someone comes after you using big craft and you have big craft to oppose them, well, your small craft quite often gets stuck in as well. And obviously this can be to varying degrees of effectiveness because, as you mentioned, a single 4-inch gun on a corvette's not going to do a whole lot other than highlight the corvette for easy sinking. But for example, at the Battle of Surigao Strait, the forces there on the US side are there to bombard Japanese shore positions during the day and defend the landing southern approach. But that means there's a bunch of PT boats. They're much smaller than destroyers. There were battleships and cruisers present on both sides in that engagement, but the PT boats were there as well, and they got stuck in. The Huskal asks, have there been any instances of steel warships catching enemy main gun rounds, as in the round has penetrated into the armour belt, but failed to go through, and then has to be dug out by the crew or dockyard workers later on? Generally speaking, in the era of the Dreadnought, the kind of period we're probably thinking of, no. And that's because at that point, when you're talking about shells coming in, they're either high explosive shells or obviously armor-piercing shells. But in either case, they have fuses, they have explosive components, and they have hollow spaces inside them, and they're traveling very fast against face-hardened belt armor, if we're talking specifically about shells interacting with the armor belt, which means they either go through or they don't. And if they don't, then either the fuse works as intended and the shell explodes, or if the fuse doesn't work as intended and for whatever reason isn't activated or is destroyed before it can be activated, the amount of energy involved in the impact tends to make the shell just fly apart anyway, i.e. it explodes, but without an explosive on board, it's just shattering, as you can kind of see in effect here. That makes it pretty much impossible to find an intact shell in an armor belt that you then have to dig out for that time period. You do find bits, and where a shell has gone through other portions of a ship and has had a chance to gradually slow down, like the inert Bismarck shell that hit really deep under Prince of Wales, then you can fish shells out. But the armor belt, that interaction tends to be far too violent for the shell to survive for very long one way or another, or for the armor belt to survive. And in this case, we're talking about the belt surviving, therefore the shell doesn't. If you go further back to the ironclad period and the very, very early introduction of steel, so maybe in compound plating, that kind of thing, then you can find some examples of that. But that tends to be, one, because the armor surface, the armor material itself is softer, therefore more yielding, less likely to shatter things on impact in the first place. And also because back then you also have a lot more solid shot involved. Now, obviously, solid shot has two advantages. One, it doesn't have a hollow space or an explosive inside it, so it's structurally just physically stronger. And two, because of that, when it strikes a surface, it's less likely to shatter into 1,000,000,001 pieces. And if it does stick this into this relatively soft surface, doesn't go all the way through, and has decelerated, and the amount of force exerted on it hasn't been enough to crack it or majorly disintegrate it at least, then you will have instances of shot being embedded. But the chances of a malfunctioning AP or HE round in the age of face-hardened steel just fetching up in, let's say, a battleship's belt completely undetonated and intact enough to be dig-outable is pretty much slim to none. Zoran asks, what was the condition of the Marine Nationale in 1944-45? Why didn't, as far as I know, they send a squadron to the Pacific along with the British ships? They did have colonies and interests there, so it would seem logical, and not all French ships were scuttled at Toulon. Is it perhaps because de Gaulle was not a sailor? It was more of a case of what ships they actually had available, because obviously a good chunk of Marine Nationale assets as a whole had been scuttled at Toulon, or in the case of Jean Bart, somewhat blown up at Casablanca. Various other ships obviously had also been damaged or lost at Casablanca. And the Free French naval forces had sustained losses themselves during combat operations up until 1944. And you've got to remember, of course, France is still occupied up until D-Day, June 1944, so you're halfway through 1944, and then you've got the continued liberation of France. And rather understandably, most Free French naval forces are somewhat more interested in helping to liberate France than they are in popping across to the Pacific to have a few potshots at retaking French colonies. Once you get into 1945 and the majority of France has been cleared of German troops, then you can perhaps argue that the Marine Nationale should show up in greater strength in the Pacific. But then again, you have to factor in that, as we said, the bulk of Marine Nationale assets are unavailable. And then what have they got left? So you've got Richelieu, which does operate in the Pacific along with the British. But then what else? There's a bunch of small craft that have been given to them, frigates and corvettes and so forth. Not really all that useful in the 1945 Pacific. There's a handful of destroyers and cruisers that the Free French Navy has had to hand during the ongoing campaign, but that's a very small number, not enough to form their own independent fleet. And then you've got various units of the Marine Nationale that were under Vichy control that are still intact. So you've got a handful from the Casablanca area, and you've got a few from the Caribbean, like Bern, and then you've got elements that were locked up in various ports, like the French naval units that were in Alexandria. Now, the thing about most of those is that they are somewhat behind the times in terms of their radar, anti-aircraft, and other capabilities. In theory, if you add them all together, there's enough, at least certainly if you base them around Richelieu as the linchpin, to at least form what in modern terms would maybe a surface action group or a surface patrol group, maybe an escort group of some description, operating under their own recognizance. But you'd have to modernize them all first, and Britain doesn't have the space or the time. And the Americans, after the experience of modernizing Richelieu, bearing in mind that at this point Britain and America are both operating under the imperial measurement system and the French is all metric, the Americans want nothing further to do with extensive overhauls and refits of French vessels. They'll do some basic stuff, but the amount of time and resources that would be needed to overhaul enough of the collective Marine Nationale assets in mid-45 to get them up to a spec where they could operate as a coherent independent fleet without operating just as part of the British Pacific Fleet, it's just far too much. The Americans won't go for it. France has just been freshly liberated. They don't have the resources to do that immediately, and the war is quite clearly wrapping up anyway. There are a lot more French assets in the Pacific in the immediate post-war environment once they get a chance to complete some of the ships that were on the stocks, refit some of their older ships, etc., etc. But in 45, they've got other priorities, and they generally don't have anywhere near the number of modernised assets to take to the Pacific on their own. Jim Smitty asks, I'm currently reading The Battle of Britain by James Holland. On page 479, he recounts the story of Ron Walsh, a sailor on the Foyle Bank. Prior to the war, he had deserted from service with the Royal Navy. When war broke out, he returned to service and was brought up on charges for desertion right away. But he was offered a king's pardon for service during the war. How common was it for the Royal Navy in the early days of World War II to overlook sailors who have deserted from service prior to the war but returned at the start of the war and then be offered a king's pardon in exchange for wartime service? It wasn't common, because if you deserted from the Royal Navy, there was a reasonable chance you'd be caught and hauled back and have charges brought up against you well before a war broke out. But then, assuming for whatever reason the Royal Navy hadn't chosen to pursue you, or you'd managed to evade their pursuers, then if war breaks out and you're a unaccounted for deserter and you rock up and say, hey, I'd like to sign up again, it's going to be analysed on a case-by-case basis. So, for example, what kind of disciplinary record does this person have beforehand? If this person has, been a serial defaulter, lots of disciplinary issues, and it's all culminated in them just walking off, potentially to avoid more serious charges, then volunteer or not, you're almost certainly going to be up on charges pretty much ASAP. Conversely, if you've got pretty much no disciplinary record at all, everything was fine, and you just got fed up for whatever reason and waltzed off, well, it's much more likely they're going to say, okay, for the sake of the war effort, we're going to say, look, if you're prepared to behave now, then we'll let it go. I give you a king's pardon. And factor into that also transferable skills. So if you were an ordinary seaman, for example, and particularly one with a bad record, it's much more likely they just bring you up on charges and stick you in prison. Whereas if you were, say, a gunnery specialist officer or a torpedo specialist officer, or basically something with good identifiable skills that you could turn around and either teach to other people, or that were in short supply in the Navy because of the expansion of ships, and obviously that you always need experienced gunners and stokers and so forth, that would also play into it. So if you had a few minor infractions on your record before, but you were really, really skilled, much more likely to be offered a king's pardon. If you're just, general crew, and maybe your reason for desertion was you were being brought up on assault charges and you didn't want to face those, it's much more likely they'll be like, great, thanks for turning yourself in, off to prison with you. They might give you a reduced sentence for showing patriotism and actually showing up for a change, at which point you could then be expected to continue in service somewhere. But as I said, case-by-case analysis of what's going on with each individual, because the absolute last thing you want, especially at the beginning of World War II when everyone's extremely paranoid about German spies, is to have a deserter come along who theoretically might have been turned by the Germans, and then have them aboard Navy ships reporting everything that they're doing. Ernest Evans Went Leroy Jenkins asks, there's a story going around where, at the Battle of Cape Matapan, the cruiser Pola suffered a comedy of errors that ended with the crew having a drunken party on deck while half naked when the British boarded it. How much truth is there to this? There's a small element of truth, but I think by the point you get to the stories you summarised it, I think it's grown a bit too large in the telling to be considered entirely truthful. So there were definitely people who were drunk aboard Pola and in the water around Pola on the night that she was sunk. However, when you actually look into the original sources, i.e. the accounts of the British crew who boarded the ship from HMS Jervis and the other British ships that hauled in survivors from Pola, and when you look at some of the testimony from the survivors who were aboard Pola itself as well, it wasn't the entire crew. So accounts where they say, oh, the whole crew of Pola was drunk, that's not true. Apart from anything, when it came time to get the survivors off what was left of Pola and get them aboard other ships, quite a number of Pola's crew were quite active in helping and were quite disciplined in doing so, which is very difficult to do if you're flat roaring drunk. What seems to have happened is two things. Firstly, early on, when Pola was initially hit, crippled, and damaged, some men went over the side out of panic, or were blown over the side, or whatever. There's a variety of specific claims about why some of them went over the side. But in any case, when they were fished back out of the water, they were given what's effectively brandy to drink to help warm them up. I mean, obviously, as you know, if you drink a bunch of alcohol, your skin gets flushed, you feel warm, but that actually helps cool you down, which is somewhat counterproductive to, not getting hypothermia. But nonetheless, that's what was done at the time. And when you take into account that some of those men would have been at action stations for quite a while, because remember, the Italian fleet was at action stations, then they came under repeated air attack, and then Pola was hit by a torpedo, and then at some point thereafter these men have been dunked in freezing cold seawater. Yeah, they hadn't eaten anything for a while. They'd been in a very high adrenaline, high stress environment. If you give them a nice big slug of brandy to gulp down, that's going to hit them a heck of a lot harder than it normally would. So those people would exhibit some signs of intoxication. And then separately, when the final orders to abandon ship came along, one of the Pola's survivors points out that it was a bit confused. There was a little bit of, some people immediately going overboard, others deciding they weren't going to go overboard immediately, others deciding they were going to stay on the ship. It wasn't particularly well organized at the beginning. There were a fair number of casualties in the water from a bunch of people who were all trying to claim a single raft, and no one cottoned on to the fact that this raft had sunk 3 or 4 times, dumping everybody who was on board into the water, but nonetheless. And as part of that, he also mentions that some crew, particularly those who'd had previously had disciplinary issues, decided that, well, if discipline is breaking down and the ship's going down anyway, they were going to break into the alcohol stores. Now, some sources say it was the ship's bar, some sources say it was the officer's wine store, but whatever. So a small number, relative to the overall number of crew, did break into the ship's alcohol stores and basically decided to get themselves roaring drunk. So there would have been 2 groups of people amongst the Pola survivors who did have alcohol intoxication to one degree or another, but they were very distinctive, specific groups who were intoxicated for rather specific reasons, and this is not representative of the entirety of Pola's crew. Tank Axe asks, suppose the New Mexicos were built with 16-inch guns, as the US Navy originally wanted to. Their construction program then continues as normal, so the Tennessee class would also mount 16-inch guns, and the Colorados might start looking like prototype South Dakotas. Thus, by 1922, the US Navy would have 5 or 6 16-inch armed battleships. How would other navies react to this construction, and what effects would this have on the Washington Naval Treaty? Well, to be honest, I doubt the Colorados would look like prototype South Dakotas, because that would involve a much, much larger vessel, and even if the US Navy is able to get 16-inch guns on when they initially ask for them, and then carry that through as a commonality, the simple fact of the matter is they're still under a lot of financial pressure from Congress to try and keep the overall size of their battleships down. I mean, that's why they were, amongst other reasons, as well as size as well as cost, that's why they were forced to stick with 14-inch guns for as long as they were. So I think the Colorados will just look like they historically did. But nonetheless, that little quibble aside, assuming that the US goes with 16-inch guns from the New Mexicos onwards, the immediate response from the other navies is going to be relatively limited, largely because virtually nobody else is going to be building capital ships to be able to respond to this in any kind of immediate term. Because if you look at the French, they've suspended all capital ship construction during the war. The Italians are struggling with the Caracciolos. The Germans, well, the last thing they lay down is Württemberg, but she's a Bayern class, slightly modified. They've got 15-inch guns, but they're not going to alter the last ship just for that. Then you've got the British. The Queen Elizabeth and Revenge classes are started before the war. The New Mexicos are laid down in 1915, so they're not going to be in a position to change their designs. The Renowns are built using materials pre-ordered for their Revenge class equivalents, so they're still going to have 15-inch guns. Courageous, Glorious, Furious are not really capital ships, so they're fundamentally irrelevant to this. So that leaves you with only 2 classes of ship that are started afterwards and actually seen through to completion. Obviously, the Germans have the Mackensons and the Ersatz Yorks. The chances of them responding specifically to the Americans doing something when they're in the middle of trying to counter the British is very remote, so I don't think they're going to fundamentally change how they design their battle cruisers. But the Japanese lay down the Issei class just after the Americans start the New Mexicos, and guns are one of the long lead order items. The Japanese are keeping an eye on everybody's developments, and, of course, they are focusing somewhat more on the US as a threat. So, potentially, if they get wind, especially early on, that the battleships that will eventually become the New Mexicos are to be armed with 16-inch guns, you might see the Japanese not build the Isseis as evolved Fusos, i.e. 12, 14-inch guns and 6 twin turrets. You might instead see some kind of proto-Nagato coming out in order to counter the Americans. Then, over in the UK, the only capital ship that's laid down after the New Mexicos is Hood. So, potentially, maybe, Hood might be designed with a bigger gun. So I think the Japanese would probably go with 16.1-inch guns like they did for the Nagato. The British, as we know historically, when fast forward a few more years, when they're looking at the G3s and N3s, they start off looking at 18-inch. And although they eventually settle on 16-inch due to constraints with the shipyards, they do actually look at 16.5-inch first before going down to 16-inch, which is consistent with the British gun practice, because whilst the Americans go 12, 14, 16, i.e. increments of 2 inches, the British, remember, they go 12, 13.5, 15, that's 1.5-inch increments. Logically, therefore, 16.5-inch is the next increment to go to. And in fact, the Germans ended up going for that as well, for separate reasons. And then, of course, 18-inch is another 1.5 inches above that. So the skip from 15 to 18-inch in British gun terms later on actually makes sense in that they're going 2 gun caliber increments higher. So possibly the Admiral class might be designed with 16.5-inch instead of 15-inch guns, and what effect that's going to have on their size, armament, and speed is somewhat interesting. But ultimately, obviously, only Hood is built by the time of the Washington Treaty, although maybe if they're armed with 16.5-inch guns, they might actually build the rest of them. But assuming for the sake of simplicity that the British only complete Hood, then when we wind up to the Washington Naval Treaty, then we've already got 3 New Mexicos and 2 Tennessees, so that's 5 ships. And what would be a 4 class of Colorados building, the Japanese would have 2 Isseis with 16-inch guns and Nagato and Mutsu building, so that's 4. Now, this represents something of a quandary. Firstly, with the Japanese and the Americans, because historically, obviously, everyone agreed 553 US, UK, Japan, or 15, 15, 10, etc., etc., roughly ratioed on capital ship terms. Now, back then, by not doing Washington, so therefore only having 3 Colorados, and the Japanese getting Nagato and Mutsu, that kept the balance as far as 16-inch capital ships were concerned. The problem is, by that same ratio, if the Japanese already have the Isseis and Nagatos, and the Americans have 6, so that's 4, 6, that's the ratio. The Japanese wouldn't want the Americans to build any of the Colorados, because that would give the Americans too many 16-inch ships. If the Americans insist that they do want to build the Colorados, or at least some of them, then the Japanese are going to insist on wanting to build to match. And the problem is, if you build 3 Colorados or 4 Colorados, that doesn't go into 3/5 nice and neatly, or close to it, especially since the Japanese are going to say, okay, well, we're past building the Nagatos, we've got the Tosas being laid down. So you can see how this could lead to issues, because obviously Tosa carries 10 guns, everyone else is carrying 8 guns. That in and of itself is a problem. But if the Americans say, okay, we're going to build 3 Colorados, so they have a total of 8, well, 3/5 of that is 4.8. So is Tosa 0.8 of a 16-inch capital ship? Well, no, if everyone else is 8 guns and Tosa is 10 guns, she's actually more like 1.2. But if the Americans build all 4 Colorados, then 3/5 of 9 is 5.4, and Tosa might be good, but she's not 1.4 of a 16-inch capital ship. So that could lead to all sorts of arguments, because the Japanese would probably, if the Americans insist on building Colorados, would prefer the Americans build 2 or 3 and they get to build a Tosa. The Americans, if the Japanese build a Tosa, will want all 4, so there'll be all of this kind of argument. And then from the British side, of course, whether the Americans have 8 or 9 16-inch armed ships, they're going to want at least parity or something that they can think is close to, which is then going to pose even more problems for everyone else, because, of course, apart from Tosa, everyone else has pre-1920s designed vessels. The British, because they haven't built, the rest of the admirals only have the one, which is Hood, and it's a 16.5 incher. So does that mean that the Washington Treaty actually caps everything at 16.5 inches to retroactively make Hood legal, or do they say 16 inch and just, like they did historically with displacement, quietly ignore Hood? But regardless, it's still a problem for the British, because they've got all these recently built 15-inch armed ships, the QEs, the Rs, Renown, Repulse, and Hood. They've got space for a couple of extra ships, which, whether they're 16 or 16.5 inch, will push them up to 3 total ships of equivalent gunnery. But herein is that issue I mentioned, because the British would then have scope to build either 5 or 6 more 16-inch armed ships, but that's going to pose problems for everybody, because from the Japanese and American sides, the British are getting in with 5 or 6, or actually technically 7 or 8, fully modern designs, which can take advantage of every single bit of ship design capability and technology that's come about in the past few years, which is going to give them a qualitative advantage. And on top of that, it's going to cause problems for the British, because they've got all those brand new 15-inch armed ships, and there's no way that they can build 8 or 9 total 16.5 or 16-inch armed ships and retain all of these 15-inch armed ships, which, as I said, are all pretty new. So what do you get rid of? Do you get rid of the Rs and keep the QEs because they're a little bit faster? That would give you a faster battle line, because then if you could design your 16.5 inch or 16-inch ships, whichever the limit treaty limit goes for, then your minimum floor speed is the almost 25 knots of the QEs, because Renown, Repulse, and Hood would be faster than that, in which case, by freeing up 5 hulls from there, plus your 2 that you're allowed, and then Hood, that gives you 8, which suggests perhaps more the Americans would build 3 Colorados. Or do the British not do that? Do they perhaps go, okay, we'll build 2 now, i.e. Nelson and Rodney equivalents, but then they're going to take out options on early retirement and replacement of, say, the Revenge class, in the same way that France was granted, and Italy as well, granted exemptions to start building ships earlier than the 10-year holiday. Because if they have that, then, well, short term, that might balance things out, i.e. the British have a 15 and 16 or 16.5 inch fleet total. But long term, that's going to cause some rather major issues, because then come the latter part of the 1920s, just before the Great Depression, ironically enough, the British could then legitimately turn around and potentially go, okay, we're going to replace the Revenge class with mid-interwar period 16 or 16.5 inch armed battleships, which would give them a massive leap ahead of everybody else. Who knows? Vintage Car History asks, during the war between the states, I'm aware of many naval engagements in the Atlantic, in the Gulf of Mexico, and of course on various rivers. But were there any significant naval engagements on the west coast of the US during that conflict? There were no significant naval engagements on the US Pacific coast during the American Civil War. That was for, well, mainly two reasons. Firstly, after some initial attempts by Southern Californians to secede, the US states and territories that bordered the Pacific coast remained within the Union, that being California, Oregon, and the Washington Territory, as it was at the time, bearing in mind that California and Oregon had only been in the United States as states for a little bit over a decade, and Washington wouldn't become a state till well after the American Civil War. And so with no Confederate states having a Pacific border, there was very little point in the Confederate Navy sending anything over there in terms of defense, which is where most of the naval battles of the American Civil War occurred. There was some benefit, theoretically, to commerce raiding in the Pacific, but that never really went anywhere. There were a few attempts down in Panama to get some kind of commerce raiding going. Didn't happen for various reasons. And you have CSS Alabama, but that only shows up on the opposite side of the Pacific, and CSS Shenandoah, which does operate a bit closer to the US Pacific coast, but since it never meets a Union warship in straight-up combat, you can't really say there's any major naval battles off the coast. There's a few merchant ships seized somewhere in the proximity of the US Pacific coast, but that's really about it. The other thing you've got to bear in mind is that the combined population of California and Oregon at this point makes up less than 2% of the total population of the US and Confederacy, well, the Union and the Confederacy of the United States as a whole combined. So outside of the gold trade from California, there's precious little to fight about at that stage over in that area of the world. HMS Vanguard 46 asks, how effective would the Lions have been if built in time for war service? Well, realistically, this can only be the 1939 version of the Lions, and assuming that they decide, actually, we're going to keep them under construction continuously, we're not going to divert labour off to anywhere else, resources, etc., then in theory, assuming a few of the little foibles with the 16-inch guns get worked out, Lion and Temeraire should enter service somewhere between late 42 and early to mid 43, depending on how everything goes. Now, at that stage, the vast majority of their possible usage is already past, because in a few months the Italian fleet is going to be in Malta, and due to fuel shortages, the Italian capital ships aren't really doing all that much in early to mid 43. So fighting against the Regia Marina is kind of a non-entity. By that point as well, Bismarck has been sunk and Eisenhower has been crippled, and Tirpitz and Scharnhorst are taking up space in Norwegian fjords. So in theory, Lion or Temeraire might be stuck on convoy escort duty in the Arctic, which means they could either supplement or take the place of Duke of York in the sinking of Scharnhorst. This is, of course, following the most optimistic possible timeline. But then at that point, that's it. Tirpitz is not engaged. So apart from maybe, if they're in the right place at the right time, one of them helping take out Scharnhorst, that's pretty much it as far as the European theatre is going. Obviously, shore bombardment, I guess, could be a thing, but anyone can do that. And the air threat, again, there's the UK, there's carriers, there's eventually in 44 airfields in Europe. There's not really a huge amount for them to do at that point. So if you had brand new, latest and greatest 16-inch armed capital ships, potentially with Scharnhorst on their kill roster, and a bunch of space to stick a bunch of very nice anti-aircraft guns, then potentially you could see Lion and Temeraire being kicked over to the Pacific relatively early to form the core of the Eastern Fleet, which would later morph into the British Pacific Fleet. But then again, at that point, what are they going to do? They're going to be gigantic anti-aircraft batteries to escort the carriers as the British Pacific Fleet gradually grinds its way over to meet up with the Americans. And that's pretty much all she wrote. She's not going to face. They're not going to face off against Yamato. They're not going to be put into Leyte Gulf because those are American shows. And whilst it would be quite amusing to see Lion and Temeraire square off against Yamato, Mitcher is never going to let that happen as long as he has carriers still afloat. So, in terms of effectiveness, yeah, they almost certainly would have survived the war, and potentially being, obviously, at that point, somewhat larger than the King George V's, might have made a rather interesting case for potential retention going forward into the Cold War. Certainly, perhaps a little bit better than the King George V themselves did, being somewhat war-worn and smaller, and potentially even better than Vanguard, because although they wouldn't have been quite as large as Vanguard, they would still be pretty hefty, and of course they have the advantage of there being two of them, so much as the Royal Navy would later do with Ark Royal and Eagle, you could potentially sacrifice one and you then use it as a spares depot to relatively cheaply maintain the other, which might keep the other around long enough for people to maybe look at it becoming a museum ship. But yeah, just due to the realistic time constraints of when they could be completed, realistically, their one shot at fame would be potentially, hitting Scharnhorst and then shooting down lots of kamikazes. Graham William Kidd asks, La Argentina is a prime example of a ship built for a foreign order that was better than the ships of similar type built for the Royal Navy at the time. What other 1905-ish to 1950 ship classes built for export were better than their domestic class equivalents? Mainly Royal Navy and US Navy, I guess, but including other nations if relevant. Including in this, if you could, ships designed for foreign customers but not eventually built, if the design was better than the domestic ships that were built at the same time period. How and why were the exports better, and if they'd been taken up for domestic use, what changes might they have made to history? As for the how and why element, that's actually quite interesting, but essentially it boils down to, if you are a smaller navy that's only ordering one or two or three of a thing, or in the case of maybe destroyers half a dozen of a thing, you can afford to splash out on some extras that a navy that's having to order 4 or a dozen or 2 dozen of the same thing might not necessarily be able to go for. So, if you are ordering one battleship, you can afford to pay maybe 130, 140% of what everyone else is paying for a battleship at the time on average in order to get a really, really good battleship. But for a navy that's having to order, again, 4 of that class, well, actually, if you're paying 140%, that adds up very quickly to the equivalent cost of 1.6 additional battleships. And then you have to ask yourself, as the big navy, is having this marginally better vessel worth having or spending all the money, when that extra money, when you could have another whole battleship? So an example of that, for example, would be the Rivadavia class. At the time, when they're laid down, you're also looking at the Wyoming class. So both ships have 12-inch guns. The Rivadavias have actually workable cross-deck firing. The Wyomings have them all centerline, but the Rivadavias are slightly more heavily protected and a couple of knots faster compared to the Wyomings. You then also have, in the Royal Navy, for example, the cruisers Birkenhead and Chester taken over. They were being built for foreign customers, but they're essentially derivatives of the World War I Town class cruisers, hence the names, but armed with 5.5-inch guns. And the Royal Navy actually quite likes them. They find that the 5.5-inch works considerably better than the default layout of the various Town derivatives. Unfortunately, due to the relatively limited number of exports in the 1905 to 1950 period, due to 2 world wars, plus the moratorium on major ship exports in the interwar period, it's a bit difficult to pick up other very specific examples. There's a few submarine and destroyer examples, but the world of submarines and destroyers is so variable on a class-by-class basis that saying, this direct equivalent per year, the foreign one is better than the domestic one, can be somewhat misleading, because you could go back a year or two or forward a year or two and find something substantially better being built for the home nation as well. really, if you want the era where lots of ships are being built which are substantially better than the regular ships being built for the home country, you really want to look at the late ironclad through to 1905 period, actually, the period immediately before this. But in this time period, if those exports had been taken up for domestic use or domestic production, what changes might they have made? Again, not a huge amount, because the ones outside of maybe something like La Argentina, the ones that were built in the time period you specified tend to be marginally better, but not astoundingly dramatically better. And so you would have run into that whole cost issue that I mentioned earlier. Is this slight additional margin of performance preferable in exchange for the massive amount of extra money you're going to have to shell out, especially in the Dreadnought period, where Minas Gerais or Rivadavia, which held Minas Gerais perhaps less justifiably so, considering her belt armor, but they're both held to be quite powerful. But then 2-3 years down the line, they're being superseded by ships with 13.5 and 14-inch guns. So was it worth laying out the extra cash for a couple of years of notional marginal superiority? Probably not. Now, when you get into ships that were designed, at least in terms of an overall plan, for foreign customers, but not eventually built, then things get a lot more interesting, especially when you see the sheer volume of quite terrifyingly heavily armed designs being thrown at South American and Mediterranean countries by Vickers, Armstrong, and the like in the run-up to World War I. You're talking about ships armed with 8 or 10, 16-inch guns in a period when most people are looking at 13.5-inch, maybe 14-inch guns, and the 15-inch gun is still a fair distance away. But you have to also put that into context of those were big, expensive options that even nations that were only ordering 1 or 2 of something were turning down. And when you look at the variety of options that are in place for contemporary battleships for the home nations, there are also big, expensive options with lots of guns or very heavy guns that are also turned down on similar cost grounds. So at that point, it would be slightly disingenuous to compare the rejected on the grounds of being a step too far designs against in-service designs for home nations. You then end up comparing, let's say, for example, the maximalist 10-15-inch armed Queen Elizabeth with speed option that was briefly considered at one point against, say, an 8-16-inch gun armed hypothetical Brazilian dreadnought. But with that, it is time to end this extended Drydock. That question about the 16-inch armed New Mexicos and so forth did run on a little bit longer, so apologies there, but hey, you got an extra 10 or so minutes of Drydock for that. So hopefully see you again in another video sometime soon. Thanks for now.